The hallway of Hartwell Memorial Hospital went silent. The moment Officer Colton Briggs grabbed Nurse Mara Solis by the collar of her scrubs and slammed her against the corridor wall hard enough to rattle the framed safety certificate screwed into the drywall beside her. A tray of instruments hit the floor. A patient in a wheelchair gasped and looked away. Two orderlies froze. Mara's ID badge swung on its lanyard, spun once, and went still. She didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She looked at the officer with the kind of flat, controlled calm that doesn't come from confidence. It comes from training. The kind of training that most people in that hallway had never needed and couldn't recognize. Colton Briggs was about to make the worst mistake of his career, and he had absolutely no idea. Before you read another word, if this story already has your attention, please subscribe to my channel and follow along until the very end. Hit like if you're with me, and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning had started badly and gotten worse by increments, the way bad days tend to do at hospitals where the administration has stopped pretending to care and the staff has stopped pretending not to notice. Mara Solis arrived at Hartwell Memorial Hospital in Tucson, Arizona at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the start of her shift, which was already 13 minutes later than she usually arrived. She'd been covering extra hours for 3 weeks running, not because anyone asked her to, not because she was being paid overtime at the rate she was owed, but because the night shift charge nurse had a sick kid at home and the morning float pool kept calling out. Mara had absorbed this gap without complaint. She was 28 years old, 5'6", with dark hair she kept pulled back tight, and a face that colleagues frequently described as unreadable, which they usually meant as a mild criticism. She took it as neither. She changed into clean scrubs in the locker room, clipped her badge, Mara Solis, RN, Emergency Department, to her chest, and walked the back route through the supply corridor to the ER. It was a habit she'd developed in her first month at Hartwell. The main halls were where the administrators walked. The supply corridor was where the actual work happened, and Mara had always been more interested in what was happening than in who was watching. The ER was already moving when she pushed through the double doors. A 12-year-old with a broken arm in Bay 3. A construction worker with a nail through his left hand in Bay 5. A woman in her 60s sitting rigidly upright in the triage waiting area. The particular stillness of someone who has been downplaying chest pressure for 4 hours before someone finally made her come in. Mara flagged the last one to the charge nurse on duty, Priya Balan, who nodded and moved immediately. That was the thing about Priya. She didn't need things explained twice. Overnight was brutal, Priya said as she pulled a fresh intake form. 2 ambulance drops at 3 a.m., both critical. We're down 1 attending until noon. Which attending? Hollis called out. Stomach thing, apparently. Mara didn't say what she was thinking, which was that Dr. Hollis called out with some version of a stomach thing approximately once every 3 weeks, and that the pattern had begun to feel less like illness and more like schedule management. She took the board from the wall, scanned the current assignments, and started her rounds. The morning passed in the specific blur that experienced ER nurses know well. Not chaos, exactly, but a sustained state of managed urgency, where the moment you finish one thing, 2 more things have already started. She placed 2 IVs, assisted with a laceration repair, caught a medication error before it reached the patient, a dosage transcription that would have given a 110-pound woman 3 times the correct amount of a blood thinner, and talked a frightened 9-year-old through a blood draw without the child shedding a single tear. Small things. The kind of things that never appear in any institutional report and that families remember for the rest of their lives. At 11:20 a.m., she went into the supply room to restock her cart. The supply room at Hartwell was a space Mara knew well. She'd spent enough time in it to notice when things were off. Not dramatically off, not empty shelves or obvious shortages, but subtly off, the kind of discrepancy that only registers if you've been paying attention to the same inventory long enough to have a baseline. She noticed it for the first time about 6 weeks ago. Specific items cycling through faster than patient volume explained. Items that had particular value outside a hospital context. Items that, in other settings, in other circumstances, Mara had learned to account for with extreme precision. She noted it. She said nothing yet. She started keeping her own records. She was reaching for a box of sterile dressings when she heard the supply room door open behind her. She turned. The man who walked in wasn't a nurse or a technician or anyone she'd seen on the floor before. I was in his mid-40s, wearing civilian clothes that were just slightly too neat for a hospital visitor. Pressed slacks, a collared shirt, shoes with a specific kind of sole. He looked at her with the brief, dismissive assessment of someone who has decided in advance that a person in scrubs is not a concern. "Can I help you?" Mara asked. "Storage audit," he said, without looking at her again. He was moving toward the back shelf. "This area is restricted to clinical staff," Mara said. "Do you have credentials?" He stopped. Looked at her again, differently this time. "I said it's an audit." "I heard you. I asked about credentials." His jaw tightened slightly, the way jaws do when someone isn't used to being asked the same question twice. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a card that he held up briefly, too briefly for Mara to read it fully, and then returned to his pocket. "I'm going to need to see that properly," she said. "Lady, I don't have time for—" "Then come back when you do." She stepped between him and the shelf, not aggressively, simply in the way. "This is a restricted area and I need to see your authorization." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out. Mara stood still for a moment after he left. She noted the time, 11:24 a.m. She noted what he'd been walking toward, the secondary cabinet along the back wall, where specific categories of controlled supplies were stored. She added it to her records when she returned to her station. She didn't know yet that the man's name was Warren Tillis. She didn't know yet that he worked for Marcus Devlin, Hartwell's chief operating officer. She didn't know yet that what she'd interrupted was not an audit, but a routine transfer, one of many that had been happening, quietly and efficiently, for the better part of 8 months. What she knew was that something was wrong, and that knowing something is wrong and doing something about it are two very different problems. She kept working, she kept watching, she kept her notes. By 2 in the afternoon, the ER had cycled through 2 more ambulance arrivals, and the construction worker with the nail in his hand had been discharged with a clean repair, a tetanus booster, and strict instructions he would probably partially ignore. Mara was at the nurse's station updating charts when she first saw Officer Colton Briggs. He came through the ambulance bay entrance, not the main doors. He was in uniform, Tucson PD, Patrol Division, and he walked with the particular stride of someone who expects to be accommodated. He was broad-shouldered, maybe 35, with a short, neat haircut and the kind of expression that sits perpetually somewhere between impatience and mild contempt. He didn't stop at the security desk. He walked directly to the center of the ER floor and looked around like he was surveying property. Priya intercepted him before he got much further. "Officer, can I help you?" "I need to speak with the charge nurse about a supply theft report." "I'm the charge nurse." "Priya Balan. What's this regarding?" Briggs pulled a folded paper from his breast pocket and opened it without handing it to her. He read from it rather than giving her any opportunity to examine it. "There's been a report of unauthorized removal of controlled medical supplies from this facility, submitted by administration this morning." Priya's expression stayed neutral, but Mara, who had stopped pretending to update the chart she was looking at, recognized the particular steadiness that nurses use when they're buying themselves time to think. "Administration filed a theft report." "Correct. I need access to your supply logs and I need to speak with the staff who were present in the supply room this morning." "I'll need to see the report," Priya said. Briggs looked at her with the expression of someone who considered that response a personal inconvenience. He folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. "I don't have to show you the internal document. This is an active investigation. Then I need to contact our legal department before I give you access to anything. You can do that after I've spoken with the individual in question." He looked past Priya directly at Mara. "You, Nurse Solis?" Mara set down the chart. "Yes." "Step away from the station." She walked around the desk and stood in front of him, arms at her sides. She was used to being looked at as though she were smaller than she was. She was used to people making decisions about her before she'd said anything. "Were you in the supply room at 11:20 this morning?" Briggs asked. "Yes." "Did you remove items from the controlled supply cabinet?" "No." "Did you have contact with an individual in that area?" "A man came in without credentials. I asked him to leave. He left." Briggs looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but a recalibration. like he'd been given information that didn't match what he expected to find. That individual is a hospital administrator with authorized access. He filed a report stating that you removed items from the cabinet before he arrived and hid them on your person. Mara kept her face level. That's not what happened. We have a witness statement that says differently. Then your witness statement is false. The way she said it, flat, not heated, with the specificity of someone correcting a factual error rather than defending herself emotionally, seemed to irritate Briggs in a way that pure defiance wouldn't have. He stepped closer, not close enough to constitute anything she could formally object to, just close enough to make clear he was choosing how close to stand. "Do you understand what you're being accused of?" he said. "I understand what I'm being told. I'm also telling you it didn't happen. Nurses who steal controlled medical supplies go on a federal registry," he said. "You lose your license. You don't work in healthcare again. You understand that?" "I understand the consequences of what you're describing," Mara said. "I'm telling you I didn't do it." The conversation was attracting attention now. Patients in nearby bays could hear, which Mara suspected was not accidental on Briggs's part. Two nurses at the far end of the station had stopped working and were watching with the carefully blank expressions of people who want to see what happens but don't want to be noticed watching. A physician who had been walking through stopped near the supply hall doorway and stood still. Briggs reached out and took Mara's ID badge from her lapel. She didn't stop him. She stood still. "You're being removed from this floor pending investigation," he said. "If you interfere with this process in any way, including going to the media or contacting your union, I will treat that as obstruction." "I need that badge to exit secured areas of the hospital," Mara said evenly. "Someone will escort you." He turned to the nearest orderly, a young man named Garrett, who looked like he wished he were anywhere else, and said, "Walk her out." Priya stepped forward. "Officer, this is not the appropriate—" "Ma'am, I'd advise you not to obstruct an active law enforcement action." Priya's mouth closed. Not in submission. Mara knew Priya well enough to recognize the particular look of someone who has decided that the next move needs to be smarter than the current one. She gave Mara a look that communicated clearly, "I'm not done with this." Mara picked up her water bottle from the counter, the single personal item at the station, and walked with Garrett to the side exit. She did not look back. Not because she wasn't angry, but because anger wasn't the most useful thing she could be carrying out of that room. Outside, the Arizona heat was immediate and brutal. It was late afternoon and the sun had been beating the asphalt all day. Mara sat on a concrete planter near the ambulance bay entrance and set her water bottle beside her. Garrett, clearly miserable about the whole thing, hovered for a moment and then said, "I'm really sorry, Mara," and went back inside. She sat with it. She thought about Warren Tillis walking toward that back cabinet. She thought about the pattern she'd identified over 6 weeks. The items missing, the volume, the specific categories. She thought about how a report had materialized this morning, filed by administration, accusing her of exactly the kind of theft she had been quietly documenting someone else for. She pulled out her personal phone and opened the Notes app. She went through her records, dates, times, item categories, her own observations. Everything was there. The problem was that everything being there, in her private notes, on her personal phone, was very different from those records being credible in any official context. She was a floor nurse who'd been escorted out of the building after a theft accusation filed by the hospital's COO's associate. Anything she presented would be framed as self-interested fabrication. She thought about that for a long moment. Then she thought about who would know how to handle this. She didn't reach for the phone to make that call. Not yet. There was a protocol she'd followed in situations worse than this one, and the first step of that protocol was to assess and wait. Gather your surroundings. Don't move until you understand what's moving. She noticed the black SUV parked in the restricted area near the ambulance turnaround, 2 men sitting inside it, not talking, facing forward. Civilian plates, but a specific antenna configuration she hadn't seen on civilian vehicles. She noticed a second vehicle, parked at a different angle, that gave a clear sight line to the ER entrance. And then she heard it, distant but growing, the specific rhythmic sound of a helicopter approach. Not a civilian medical helicopter. She could tell the difference. This sound was heavier, the rotation pattern slightly different, the approach angle too direct and low for standard flight paths around the hospital. The black helicopter appeared over the eastern tree line and descended fast. It landed in the hospital's rooftop helipad, not the patient intake pad on the south side, but the unrestricted roof pad, which hadn't been used in months. Mara stood up. Through the ambulance bay window, she could see the ER floor erupting in the specific controlled chaos of a critical incoming patient. She could see Priya moving fast. She could see someone running for a crash cart. She stood outside the glass and watched the doors she could no longer walk through. Then she heard the sound she wasn't expecting. It started low. A sharp, focused vocalization, not a bark exactly, more of an alert signal. And then it accelerated. From around the side of the building, where the secondary entrance fed into the ambulance dock, a military working dog broke from the loose grip of a handler who hadn't been prepared for the animal to make a sudden directional decision. The dog, a Belgian Malinois, lean and fast and extraordinarily purposeful, came around the corner at a run. It ran directly to Mara. It sat in front of her, pressed its head against her thigh, and held still. The handler came around the corner 30 seconds behind the dog, breathing hard, and stopped when he saw the two of them. His expression shifted through 3 distinct phases: confusion, recalibration, something that might have been recognition. "Tango," he said, to the dog. The dog did not move. The handler looked at Mara. Then he spoke into the radio on his shoulder, and what he said was not a command. It was a question. He was asking someone else, someone who would know, whether what he was seeing was possible. Mara looked down at the dog. She put one hand on the top of its head, gently, in the specific place. The animal exhaled slowly and stayed exactly where it was. The hospital doors opened. 2 men in tactical gear walked out. Behind them, a uniformed officer. Not Tucson PD, not any local designation Mara could immediately read from the patch. Looked at her across the distance of the ambulance dock with an expression that had nothing casual in it. He spoke. The words carried, "Are you Sergeant Mara Solis?" She hadn't been called that in 2 years. She didn't answer immediately. She stood there with her hand on the dog's head, in the Arizona heat, outside the hospital that had just expelled her, and she looked at the officer who had just used a title she had left behind. "Who's asking?" she said. The man walked toward her with the measured pace of someone who has authority and doesn't need to perform it. "Major Dane Ruark, 75th Medical Readiness Command," he said, stopping 3 feet away. "We have a soldier on that roof who is dying and whose blood type and injury profile you already know because you treated him 18 months ago in a forward operating base in conditions that would have killed anyone else in that room." He looked at the dog still pressed against her leg. "Tango already made his decision. I'm asking you to make yours." Mara looked at the hospital. She looked at the door she had been walked out of 40 minutes ago. She thought about Warren Tillis and the cabinet and the report filed against her and Colton Briggs's hand on her badge. Then she looked at the major. "Who's with him?" she asked. "2 trauma surgeons. Neither one of them knows what they're looking at." She picked up her water bottle from the planter. She didn't rush. She looked at the handler and she said, "Tango comes with me." The handler looked at the major. The major nodded. Mara walked toward the door. The dog walked exactly at her left side, where it had been trained to walk, in the way that it had been trained to walk there by someone who no longer wore the uniform, but had not, in any way that mattered, ever stopped being the person who knew how. The rooftop access stairwell smelled like hot metal and motor oil, and Mara took the steps 2 at a time without being told to hurry. Major Ruark was behind her. Tango was beside her. The handler stayed at the door. The rooftop pad was operational, but barely. Scorch marks on the concrete from old landings, a windsock that had faded to almost white, and the helicopter sitting slightly askew because the pilot had brought it down fast rather than clean. The rotors were still cycling down when Mara pushed through the rooftop access door and saw the situation in front of her. The soldier was on a portable field litter that 2 medics had carried up from the aircraft. He was young, mid-20s at most, with the particular lean build of someone who had been running heavy loads for years. His uniform was partially cut away. Someone had already started an IV line, and the fluid bag was running, but the color of it against the sunlight told Mara it wasn't the right choice for what she was seeing. His skin had the dull, grayish cast of someone whose perfusion was dropping. His breathing was audible from 10 feet away. Not labored exactly, but wrong in rhythm, with a specific catch on the left side that she recognized before she'd consciously processed it. 2 trauma surgeons from inside the hospital were crouched beside him. One of them, A heavy-set man in his 50s named, she would later learn, Dr. Fenwick, was on the phone. The other, a younger woman, was holding a penlight over the soldier's eyes and not finding what she was looking for. Mara crouched beside the litter without asking permission. "What's his name?" she said to the nearest medic. "Corporal Jesse Varick." She put 2 fingers on Varick's neck. Pulse was there, fast and thread-like. She looked at his chest, watched the rise, confirmed what she'd heard from 10 feet away. The left side was moving less. "He's got a tension pneumo developing on the left," she said. "The fluid's making it worse." Dr. Fenwick lowered his phone. "We've been managing his The IV needs to slow down. He needs a needle decompression, left second intercostal, mid-clavicular line, before he crashes on us." She looked up at Fenwick directly. "Do you have the kit, or should I ask the medics?" There was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds too long. In a different context, in a hospital corridor or a committee meeting, that pause would have been normal. The processing time of someone deciding whether to take direction from a nurse who appeared from outside the building with a military dog, on a rooftop, with a man's breathing. Getting worse by the minute, it was 2 seconds. Mara didn't have patience for. "Medics," she said, and held out her hand without looking away from Varick. The medic behind her put a needle decompression kit in her palm. She had it open in 4 seconds. "Wait," Fenwick started. Major Ruark said quietly from behind her, "Dr. Fenwick, let her work." The needle went in clean. The hiss of released air pressure was immediate and audible. Varick's left chest wall began moving again within 30 seconds. His color didn't improve dramatically. It wasn't supposed to, not yet. But the rhythm of his breathing changed. The catch disappeared. His pulse, when she checked it again, had slowed by roughly 12 beats per minute. Not fixed, stabilized, which was the only thing that mattered right now. "He needs a chest tube and he needs it in a controlled environment," Mara said, standing. "The decompression will hold him for transport, but not long. How far to the nearest Level I trauma center?" "University Medical is 22 minutes by ground," the younger surgeon said. Her name tag read Dr. Avila. She was looking at Mara with an expression that was somewhere between professional assessment and something more personal than that. "Then he needs to be moving in the next 10 minutes. Mara looked at Rourke. "Do you have authority to transfer?" "I have authority over everything on this roof," Rourke said. "Then let's not waste it." The next 8 minutes were the kind that don't feel like 8 minutes. They feel like a compressed version of time where everything costs effort and nothing is guaranteed. Mara worked with the medics to prepare Varick for transport, switching the fluid line to a more appropriate solution, keeping the decompression site clear, monitoring the breathing pattern every 90 seconds. Tango stayed at the edge of the rooftop near the stairwell door, out of the way, watching. The dog didn't pace. It sat and tracked Mara's movement with the patient focus of an animal that has been in enough operational environments to understand the difference between a moment to act and a moment to wait. Dr. Fenwick made 2 more attempts to reassert himself during the process. The first time, Mara answered him with a 1-sentence clinical explanation that was accurate, necessary, and delivered without any visible emotion. The second time, she didn't answer him at all. She was in the middle of checking something more important, and Dr. Avila stepped in and handled it, quietly and efficiently, in the way of someone who had also made a fast assessment and was acting on it. When Varick was ready to move, his eyes opened briefly. They tracked to Mara's face and held there. "You're going to be okay," she said. Not as comfort, as information. His mouth moved. She leaned in. "Tango," he said. His voice was rough and thin, but he said it clearly. "He's here," she said. "He found you." Something in Varick's face changed. Not relaxation exactly, but a kind of settling. He closed his eyes. The medics moved him to the elevator that serviced the roof. The helicopter would reposition to University Medical to meet the ground transport there. Major Ruark walked beside the litter and gave Mara the opportunity to step back, which she did not take. She rode the elevator down with them. At the ground floor, the ambulance was already pulled to the dock. As the doors opened and the medics rolled Varick out, Mara almost walked directly into Officer Colton Briggs. He was standing in the main corridor with 2 other officers and Warren Tillis, who was standing slightly behind Briggs, with an expression of someone who had expected this situation to have resolved itself by now and was becoming irritated that it hadn't. Briggs looked at Mara, then at the military medics, then at Major Ruark behind her. His face ran through several calculations in quick succession. "She's under an active investigation," Briggs said. He addressed Ruark directly, which told Mara that Briggs had correctly identified where the authority in the group was located. "She's not permitted in this facility. She just kept one of my soldiers alive on your rooftop," Ruark said. His voice was entirely neutral. "Your investigation is a local matter. This is a federal operation. She's accused of theft of controlled—" "I heard you." Ruark stopped walking. He turned fully toward Briggs, which was something Mara noticed. He hadn't fully stopped for anything else in the last 30 minutes. "I've also been briefed on the timeline of events that led to that accusation. I'd encourage you to be very deliberate about what you say next." Briggs was not by nature someone who backed down easily. Mara could see that. He had the stubborn set of a person who understood his position as self-evidently correct and treated all opposition as a form of bad faith. But there was something in Ruark's tone. Not a threat, nothing overt, just a particular quality of certainty that made the corridor feel smaller than it was. Tillis put his hand on Briggs's arm. A small gesture. Briggs noticed it. The ambulance team had cleared the building with Varric. Mara had watched him go. She turned back to the hallway. "I'd like my badge back," she said. Briggs looked at her. His jaw was tight. "That's hospital property," she said. "And I didn't steal anything, which means your grounds for holding it are going away faster than you think." Tillis said something to Briggs in a low voice. Briggs didn't move for 3 full seconds. Then he reached into his breast pocket and held out the badge without looking at her directly. She took it and clipped it back to her scrubs. She walked down the corridor toward the ER without waiting to see what happened next behind her. Priya met her at the nurses' station with the expression of someone who had been managing 2 crises at once and was relieved to have one of them resolve. "Are you okay?" Priya said. "I'm fine. What's the floor look like?" "Busy, but I need to tell you something before you start." Priya lowered her voice. "Marcus Devlin was here 40 minutes ago, COO. He came down personally, which he never does. He was in the supply room with Tillis, and then he went to the administrative office on the 2nd floor. He had his lawyer with him." Mara absorbed that. "Who else knows?" "About the supply room? Most of the staff heard what happened with the officer this morning. The formal part, the investigation allegation. I haven't shared that beyond what I had to for shift management purposes." "The military team is going to be back," Mara said. "Major Ruark said he's been briefed on the timeline, which means someone gave him information before they landed. He knew my name before the dog ran to me." Priya was quiet for a moment. "What do you think is happening?" Mara thought about how to answer that honestly without saying more than she could confirm. "I think what's happening in that supply room is a lot bigger than me." She picked up a chart. She went back to work. The afternoon moved. 3 new patients. A pediatric case that required a specialist consult, a cardiac event in a 68-year-old who had driven himself to the hospital because he didn't want to bother anyone, and a minor laceration that became complicated when the patient disclosed a clotting disorder they'd forgotten to mention at triage. Mara managed all 3. She charted. She communicated with the specialists. She did not think about Warren Tillis or Marcus Devlin or what was happening in whatever room Briggs had retreated to. At 4:15, Dr. Avila found her in the corridor. "Can I have a minute?" Avila said. They stepped into the small consultation room near Bay 7, which was the only room on the floor that offered any real privacy. "I've worked trauma for 11 years, Avila said without preamble. "I've seen a lot of people perform under pressure. What you did on that roof, that assessment, the speed of it, the needle decompression, that's not nursing school training. People learn different things in different places," Mara said. "Where did you learn that?" Mara looked at her steadily. "Why are you asking?" Avila leaned against the wall. She seemed to be working through something. "Because Major Ruark came to me after the transport left and asked me to document my clinical observations of the intervention on the rooftop. He was specific about what he wanted documented and how." She paused. "He's building something, some kind of formal record, and I think it involves you." Mara didn't respond immediately. She was thinking about the fact that Ruark had already been on that roof, already had her name, already had a sense of the situation here, and that none of that had happened by accident. "What did you document?" Mara asked. "The truth," Avila said simply, "which is that Corporal Varric would likely have arrested before we got him to the OR without the intervention that was provided." Mara nodded once. I'm not asking you to tell me anything, Avila said. I just want you to know that what I saw today, I'm not going to pretend I didn't see it. She left the room. Mara stood in there alone for a moment, in the particular quiet of a space that is only quiet because the hallway outside hasn't caught up yet. Oh. At 5:40, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. Solis, she said. Sergeant. The voice was male, measured, older, not Ruark. I'm not a sergeant anymore, she said. That's one interpretation. A pause. My name is Colonel Harlan Bristedt, JAG Corps, 75th Medical Readiness Command. I need to speak with you about an ongoing investigation that intersects with your current employment situation. Mara leaned against the wall of the corridor. How long has the investigation been ongoing? 14 weeks? So it predated her own records by 8 weeks. Someone had been watching Hartwell Memorial from outside long before Mara started noticing things from inside. What do you need from me? She said. Right now? Nothing. I want you to know this call happened. I want you to know that Major Ruark's team documented the events on the roof today. And I want you to know that the report filed against you this morning has already been flagged by my office as potentially retaliatory in nature, pending review of the source and timeline. Pending review, she said. That's not the same as cleared. No, he said. It isn't. But it's a different position than you were in this morning. She said nothing. There's one more thing, Bristedt said. Devlin and Tillis accessed the secondary supply cabinet at 3:47 a.m. 2 nights ago. We have footage. They didn't know the camera had been repositioned. Mara closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about the 6 weeks of notes on her phone. She thought about Warren Tillis's hand reaching toward that cabinet. She thought about Briggs's fingers on her badge. What happens next? She said. That depends on what they do in the next 12 hours, Bristedt said. People who believe their cover is intact usually keep moving. People who feel cornered do something else. The line went quiet. Then he said, You should know that Corporal Varric is out of surgery. The chest tube went in clean. He's critical but stable. Good, she said. He asked about the dog and about the nurse. In that order. A brief pause that might have been something like warmth. Get some rest, Sergeant. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. The call ended. Mara stood in the hallway and held the phone loosely in her hand and thought about the word retaliatory. About 14 weeks. About a camera repositioned in a room where she'd never seen a camera. About Devlin having a lawyer present when he visited the hospital that afternoon. She thought about the soldier on the roof saying tango with his last functional breath before the decompression, because the dog mattered to him and he needed to know it was there. She thought about the specific weight of caring what happens to the people around you, even when the situation you're in is actively trying to take everything from you. She walked back to the nurse's station. She picked up the next chart. At 6:10, she heard Priya's voice change register in the way it does when something unexpected walks through the door. She looked up. Marcus Devlin was standing at the entrance to the ER floor, not in administrative clothes this time. He was in a suit jacket, and his expression had a different quality than it had earlier in the day. Earlier, he'd been working through channels. Now there was something harder in the way he stood, the way his eyes moved across the floor and found her. Beside him was not his lawyer. Beside him was Colton Briggs, in plain clothes, and two men Mara didn't recognize, not hospital staff, not police, not military. Devlin looked at her across the span of the ER floor, and what passed between them in that look was not ambiguous. It was the specific recognition between two people who now understand exactly what they are to each other. He took a step toward her. Mara didn't move. She set the chart down carefully. She kept her hands where they were and her face level and her breathing at the pace she had trained it to hold in situations where everything was about to change. The ER doors behind Devlin opened again. Major Ruark walked in with 4 people in civilian dress that didn't fool anyone who knew what to look at, and behind them, 2 individuals in federal law enforcement jackets that didn't leave anything to interpretation. Devlin stopped walking. The room held its breath. Ruark didn't rush. That was the thing Mara noticed first. He walked into the ER at the same measured pace he'd used on the rooftop, like urgency was a resource he'd learned not to spend carelessly. The 4 people behind him spread into the room with the practiced, unobtrusive efficiency of people who had done this before, in spaces where visibility mattered. The 2 federal agents in jackets stayed near the entrance. Devlin had stopped moving. He was smart enough to understand what he was looking at, even if he hadn't expected it here and now. His eyes moved across the room once, quick, calculating, and then settled into the careful stillness of someone who has decided that the next thing he says needs to be chosen very deliberately. Briggs was less composed. He shifted his weight, and his right hand moved toward his hip before he remembered he was in plain clothes and caught himself. One of the federal agents noticed. She didn't say anything. She just repositioned slightly. The two men Mara didn't recognize, the ones who had come in with Devlin, were already backing toward the far wall. Not running, just finding the edges of the room, which was its own kind of answer. Ruark stopped 6 feet from Devlin. He looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they've already solved but are now confirming. "Marcus Devlin," Ruark said. Not a question. "I'm here to address a personnel matter," Devlin said. His voice was composed. Boardroom voice, measured and controlled. The voice of someone who has navigated difficult rooms before. "This is a hospital administration issue, and I don't believe federal—" "The personnel matter has been superseded," Ruark said. "We're executing a federal warrant for the seizure of records and controlled supply inventories at this facility. You're being asked not to leave the building." "I'd like to speak with my attorney." "That's your right. You can make that call from here." Ruark turned to one of the agents. "Get administration's office secured. Nobody in or out until the records team is set up." Mara watched Devlin's face go through something during those seconds. Not panic. He was too controlled for that. But a particular recalibration, the shift of someone who has been operating under the assumption that they have more time than they do and is now adjusting to the reality that they don't. His eyes moved to Mara. She didn't look away. He held her gaze for 2 seconds, then looked at Ruark. "Whatever she told you—" "She didn't tell us anything," Ruark said. "Sit down, Mr. Devlin." The next 40 minutes transformed Hartwell's ER floor into something between a functioning hospital and an active federal scene, which was a combination that required everyone to work harder and communicate more than anyone particularly wanted to at the end of a long shift. Mara managed it by doing what she always did. She focused on what was directly in front of her and let everything else happen at its appropriate distance. Patients still needed care. That part didn't pause. The cardiac patient from earlier needed a chart update. A new walk-in arrived with a suspected fracture. Priya handled the communications between the floor staff and the federal team with the specific competence of someone who has never been given a scenario quite like this one, but isn't going to let that show. Mara watched Briggs get separated from Devlin and placed in a waiting room off the main corridor with one of Ruark's people posted outside. He went without making a scene, which surprised her slightly. She had read him as someone who would argue at every step. But there was something in the way he watched Devlin get walked toward the administrative elevator that changed his calculation. When the people you've been working with stop fighting, you reassess. Tillis had not been on the floor when Ruark arrived. That absence registered with Mara, and she suspected it registered with the federal team as well, because 20 minutes into the operation, she saw one of the agents on a radio and heard the phrase secondary location before she was out of earshot. At 7:20, Ruark found her at the nurse's station. "We need to go through your records," he said. "My personal phone records." "Yes, with your consent." She looked at him. "I've been keeping notes for 6 weeks. Dates, times, item categories, quantities. I cross-referenced against patient volume 3 times to rule out legitimate consumption increases." "I know," he said. "Colonel Bristedt reviewed your methodology description over the phone earlier. He called it, and I'm quoting him, annoyingly thorough." "I take that as a compliment." "He meant it as one." Ruark glanced toward the administrative end of the floor. "We're going to need those records as supporting documentation for the warrant. Your observations align with the surveillance data we already have, but the internal perspective is more useful than you might think." She handed him her phone. "Notes app. Folder labeled Supply. Everything is time-stamped." He took it. Then he said, "For what it's worth, the report that was filed against you this morning, Bristedt's office has already sent formal notice to the department that filed it. The characterization in that notice is not favorable to the people who filed it." "That's not the same as cleared." "No," he said. "It isn't, but you'll be cleared. Probably by morning." She watched him walk away. She thought about probably by morning and everything that phrase still left open, And then she went to check on the suspected fracture in Bay 4, because the patient in Bay 4 needed someone to check on them, and that was something she could actually do right now. The fracture was real, a clean break of the fifth metatarsal, the kind that happens when someone steps off a curb wrong and refuses to admit for 3 hours that it's serious. Mara got the imaging ordered, and the patient stabilized with a temporary splint while the orthopedic consult was arranged. Ordinary work. The kind of thing that keeps the brain from spinning in the wrong direction. She was in the supply room, the same room where all of this had started, which was not lost on her, restocking her cart when Dr. Avila came in and closed the door. "I need to tell you something," Avila said. "Tell me." Fenwick went to Devlin's office an hour ago, before the federal team arrived. I don't know what was said, but when he came back down, he went straight to legal and he's been in there since. Mara set down the dressing she was holding. "Fenwick. He's been at this hospital for 19 years, Avila said. He's part of the furniture. And I think he knew what was happening in this room. Maybe not all of it, but enough." Mara thought about the times Fenwick had been dismissive. In the ER, on the roof, in the small ways that accumulate. She thought about how dismissiveness is sometimes just arrogance, and how sometimes it's something more functional than that. A way of not engaging with things you'd rather not have to account for. "What did you tell legal?" Mara asked. "Nothing yet. They haven't called me." Avila leaned against the shelf. "I testified to Ruark's people honestly about the rooftop. I'll testify honestly about anything else they ask me. I'm telling you about Fenwick because, I don't know. Because I think you should know who was in this building working against you and who wasn't." It was an unexpectedly direct thing to say. Mara appreciated directness enough not to dilute it with a response it didn't need. "Thank you," she said. Avila nodded and left. Mara stood in the supply room. She looked at the secondary cabinet along the back wall, the one Tillis had been walking toward that morning, the one with the camera repositioned above it that she hadn't known about. She thought about 14 weeks of federal surveillance. She thought about what it meant that all of that infrastructure had been built around a room she'd been in hundreds of times, pulling sterile dressings and IV supplies, and she'd had no idea. She thought about Varric on the roof, his chest wall not moving. She thought about what it would have cost to keep her head down and not ask Warren Tillis for his credentials. Probably nothing, in the short term. The fraud would have continued without her. The investigation would have proceeded without her notes. Varric might have had different people on that roof. Not necessarily worse people, just different. But she had asked. She'd stepped between Tillis and the cabinet, and everything since had been the specific chain of consequences that follows from that. She picked up her cart and walked back to the floor. At 8:50, Tillis was found. Mara heard it through Priya, who heard it through the radio traffic from the federal agents, who were not particularly trying to keep it quiet. He'd been located in the hospital's basement records archive, in the process of removing physical files from a storage unit that had not been listed on any current inventory. He had not resisted. He had simply sat down on the floor amid the files he'd been pulling and waited to be found, which told Mara something about what kind of person Warren Tillis actually was under the performance of authority he'd been running in that supply room. Some people are operational. Some people are just carrying out instructions and hoping the instructions are good enough to protect them when things go wrong. Tillis was the second kind. With his location confirmed, the federal agents moved to the administrative wing with purpose. Mara was at the station when she heard Devlin's voice rise in the corridor, the first time his boardroom composure had actually broken, and then go quiet as abruptly as it had risen. She didn't go to look. She updated her charts. By 9:30, the ER floor had reached the uncomfortable equilibrium of a space where a major event has happened, and the aftermath is still processing, but the immediate chaos has passed. Staff moved through their routines with the slightly heightened awareness of people who know that whatever normal is going to look like going forward, tonight is not quite it yet. Ruark returned her phone at 9:45. He sat in the chair across the station desk from her like someone who intends to stay long enough to actually say what he came to say. "Your records are being formally entered into evidence," he said, "with your name attached as the source." "I know what that means. I want to make sure you do. It means this goes to trial. You'll be called. Your employment history, the parts that are sealed, may come up in context." Mara looked at him steadily. "How sealed are they staying?" Ruark was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, more like someone being precise. The classification review was initiated last week. It predates today, so it's not contingent on what happened here. But the timeline of events, your intervention with Varek, the documentation from Avila, the fact that Tango identified you before any of us reached you, all of that is going to be part of the military record regardless of what happens with the classification. Meaning people are going to know. Some people already do, he said. The question is how much, and in what context. She thought about 2 years of building a life that didn't require explaining herself. A specific kind of privacy that wasn't quite hiding, but wasn't quite visible either. She thought about the reasons she'd made that choice, which were real reasons, not fragile ones, but which had been made in a different set of circumstances. What does the classification review affect? She asked. Your commendations, the specific operations you were attached to, the full scope of your medical interventions in theater. He paused. Not your service record. That part stands regardless. But the commendations, if they're declassified, they're part of the public military record. Mara absorbed that. And Varek's unit? They're aware of today. The handler, Staff Sergeant Pollard, he filed his own account within an hour of leaving the roof. Tango's response is in that report too. Something shifted briefly in Ruark's face. That dog has a documented alert response for 11 people. All of them are former members of units Tango was embedded with. You're the 12th. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she didn't try. Get some sleep, she said. You look tired. Ruark looked at her for a moment and almost smiled. You too, Sergeant. She didn't correct him this time. Oh. The next morning arrived gray and warm, the specific overcast that sits over Tucson in a certain season before burning off by noon. Mara was back at the hospital by 6:40. The difference in the building was immediate and specific. 3 federal vehicles were still in the parking structure. The administrative wing on the second floor had tape across the corridor entrance. Not crime scene tape, but an administrative restriction notice that amounted to the same thing. 2 staff members who Mara recognized as being part of Devlin's direct office had not shown up for their shifts. A hospital board meeting that had been scheduled for that morning had been postponed indefinitely, which nobody announced formally, but which spread through the staff by 7:15 anyway. Priya met her at the locker room door. Devlin's been placed on administrative suspension pending the federal review, Priya said. Fenwick requested a leave of absence this morning. It was approved before anyone on the board could object. And Briggs? Priya's expression tightened slightly. Released last night, but his department has been notified that he's the subject of an internal affairs review in connection with the warrant. He filed a report 2 hours later claiming that Ruark's team had obstructed a local law enforcement action. She paused. It didn't get very far. Mara opened her locker. What's the floor situation? Short-staffed but functional. The night team held it together. We're getting 2 float nurses and a per diem physician. Priya leaned against the lockers. How are you? It was a simple question, but Priya asked it in the particular way of someone who actually wants the answer. I'm okay, Mara said. And then because Priya deserved more than that. I'm tired and I'm angry and I want to get back to work. That's the honest version. Good enough, Priya said. She was in Bay 6 at 11:15, running a post-procedure check on a patient who had come in with a kidney stone at 7 a.m. and was now waiting for discharge instructions. When she heard a commotion near the main entrance that had a different character from the usual ER noise. Not an emergency sound, more like the sound of multiple people arriving in coordination. She finished her check, gave the patient the discharge information, and walked to the main corridor. The military contingent was larger than yesterday. She counted 8 uniformed personnel before she stopped counting, plus Ruark near the center of the group, plus 2 people she didn't recognize in civilian suits that had the same quality as the ones who had come in the evening before. Standing slightly apart from the group, moving with the deliberate focus of someone who has traveled some distance to be here, was a woman in a colonel's uniform who hadn't been part of any of yesterday's operation. She was reading something on a tablet. She had the look of someone who reads quickly and retains everything and asks questions that feel conversational but aren't. Mara stood at the edge of the corridor. Ruark saw her and walked over. Colonel Vera Osterman, he said quietly. She's Bristed's superior. She doesn't come to facilities herself unless it's significant. What changed? Mara asked. Tillis talked, Ruark said. All night, apparently. His legal team advised cooperation in exchange for considerations, and once he started, he didn't stop. How big is it? Ruark looked at her with an expression that was carefully level. The supply diversion from Hartwell is one node. It connects to 2 other facilities in the state. Total estimated value of diverted controlled medical supplies over the past 2 years is somewhere between $9 and $11 million. Mara stood with that for a moment. And it connects upward, she said. 3 levels above Devlin, Ruark said, which is why Osterman is here and not Bristedt. Colonel Osterman looked up from her tablet. She had the gaze of someone who takes in information from across a room as efficiently as from across a desk. She handed the tablet to someone beside her and walked over. She looked at Mara directly. Not the assessing look of someone deciding what they're dealing with, more the look of someone who has already finished that process. Sergeant Solis, she said. I'm a nurse, Mara said. You're both, Osterman said without heat. We're convening a formal review at 1400 hours in the hospital boardroom. Your presence is requested, not required, but I want to be direct with you about what it will cover. Tell me. The criminal investigation into Devlin and the connected network, the internal affairs matter regarding Officer Briggs, and the classification review of your service record, which has been escalated to my level as of this morning. Osterman's delivery was precise and even, the voice of someone who has given hard information many times and has learned that the clearest way is also the kindest. The declassification is proceeding. The commendations will be public record within 72 hours. That decision was above my authority to change, but I wanted you to hear it from me directly before it was formalized. Mara felt something shift internally. Not surprise, not exactly. More like the feeling of a door opening into a room you've kept closed for 2 years and finding that it isn't empty. Why the escalation? She asked. Because what you identified, documented, and interrupted here connects to a supply diversion network with links to 2 forward operating bases currently receiving medical resupply, Osterman said. If those supply chains were compromised, we have soldiers in active deployments receiving incomplete or counterfeit medical equipment. She let that sit for a moment. You didn't just protect patients at this hospital, you may have done something considerably larger. Mara thought about her notes in the Notes app, the dates and times and item categories. 6 weeks of paying attention to something that didn't feel right. She thought about how long she'd held back from saying anything, not because she was afraid, but because she'd needed to be sure. She thought about Varek saying tango on the roof. I'll be at the 1400 meeting, she said. Osterman nodded and returned to her group. Mara went back to work. At 12:40, her phone rang. Colonel Bristedt. The classification paperwork cleared, he said, before she could speak. I wanted you to hear it from me. Ruark told me to expect it. He told you to expect the possibility. I'm telling you it's done. A brief pause. There's something else. Briggs filed a secondary report this morning claiming that your intervention on the rooftop yesterday was unauthorized and potentially constituted interference with his active investigation. He's trying to frame it as a violation of the terms under which you were removed from the floor. Mara was quiet. I tell you this not to alarm you, Bristedt said, but because you should know that people with damaged positions tend to look for anything they can attach to. The report has no evidentiary basis, and the timeline destroys it, but it exists, and you should know it exists. He knows it won't hold, Mara said. He knows it won't hold, Bristedt agreed. He's building a paper record. It's what people do when they can't win the substance. She thanked him and ended the call. She stood in the corridor outside Bay 4, the phone in her hand, and thought about Colton Briggs sitting somewhere this morning, writing a report he knew was worthless, and the specific kind of desperation that produces that behavior. She thought about what it costs a person to be that committed to a position they can no longer defend with facts. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she recognized the shape of it. At 1:50, she was washing her hands in the staff restroom when her pager went off. Internal code, Bay 2. A patient had gone into acute respiratory distress. She dried her hands and ran. The patient in Bay 2 was a 53-year-old man who had been admitted with what was presenting as a severe allergic reaction. His airway was compromising fast. The nurse on duty had correctly activated the alert and was already positioning him, but the physician assigned to the bay was not responding to the page, and the float doctor was in surgery. Mara stepped in. She assessed. She called for the crash cart. She coordinated with the respiratory therapist who arrived 40 seconds behind her. She did what needed doing in the sequence it needed doing, working through the acute phase with the particular focus that is not calm exactly, but functions like calm from the outside. When his airway was secure and his oxygen saturation was coming back up, and the attending physician finally arrived at a dead run 12 minutes later, slightly out of breath and immediately clinical, Mara gave him the full rundown in 45 seconds without anything missing. He looked at her for a moment when she finished. "Nice work," he said simply. She nodded and went to the 1400 meeting. The boardroom on the fourth floor had never felt like a space Mara had any particular reason to be in. It was the kind of room that exists for people who make decisions about things. And for most of her time at Hartwell, she had been someone the decisions were made about. She sat at the long table now, to the right of Colonel Osterman, across from two federal attorneys, and 3 seats down from a man whose name she hadn't caught, but whose lanyard marked him as Office of the Inspector General. Bristedt joined remotely, his face on a screen at the end of the table. Ruark sat to Mara's left and said nothing, which was exactly the right call. The meeting ran for 90 minutes. It covered the evidence chain from Tillis's disclosure, the connection points to the 2 other Arizona facilities, the projected scope of the federal case against Devlin, and the 3 additional individuals named in the extended warrant. It covered the internal affairs referral regarding Briggs, which had enough documentation from Ruark's team and from the body camera footage. Briggs had been on duty when he arrived at Hartwell, meaning his camera had been running, to make the case straightforward. It covered Mara's role as both an observer who had generated supporting evidence and as a potential witness in the criminal proceedings. And then, at the end, Osterman placed a single document in front of Mara and let her read it. It was a formal commendation citation. Her name. Dates of service that she hadn't seen in print in 2 years. Operations she hadn't spoken about to anyone at this hospital. Numbers. The specific quiet numbers that appear in military commendations that describe what a person did in terms of lives rather than actions. She read it without expression. When she finished, she set it down. "This becomes public record in 72 hours, Osterman said. "I know," Mara said. "I want to ask you something," Osterman said. "Not for the record, just between us." She waited until Mara looked at her. "When you came back from deployment and took this job, did you think this kind of situation would find you?" Mara thought about it honestly. "I thought I was going to be a nurse," she said. "I thought that was enough." Osterman nodded slowly. "Is it?" Before Mara could answer, the door to the boardroom opened. One of the federal agents stepped in. She looked at Osterman. Her expression was controlled, but something in it had shifted. "We have a problem," she said. "Briggs isn't at home. He left his residence at 11 this morning. His personal vehicle is in the hospital parking structure." The room went still. "He's been in the building," the agent said. "We don't know for how long, and we can't locate him on any of the floor cameras for the past 40 minutes. Mara was already standing. "Where's Priya Balan?" she said. Nobody answered fast enough. Mara didn't wait for anyone to organize a response. She moved to the door, and the agent stepped aside without being asked, because something in the way Mara moved communicated that this was not a moment for procedural discussion. The fourth-floor corridor was quiet in the specific way of administrative spaces in the middle of a workday. A few staff, no patients. The low ambient hum of a building that functions at a different pace than the floors below it. She pulled out her phone and called Priya's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called the nurse's station direct line. Garrett answered. "Is Priya on the floor?" Mara said. "She was here like 20 minutes ago. She got a call and went to the supply corridor. I figured she was dealing with the federal guys." Mara was already moving toward the stairwell. "Is anyone with her?" I don't think so." She pushed through the stairwell door and took the steps without running, because running in a hospital creates alarm, and alarm changes behavior in people you don't want alerted. Behind her, she could hear Ruark's footsteps and the sound of the agent's radio. Ruark had made the same calculation she had and was letting her set the pace. The supply corridor on the first floor was a back passage that connected the main receiving dock to the internal distribution hub. It ran behind the ER, parallel to the ambulance bay, and it was the kind of space that hospital staff passed through constantly and nobody else had much reason to be in. It had 2 camera positions, both of which Mara now knew had been part of the federal surveillance setup. She rounded the corner into the corridor and stopped. Priya was at the far end, near the secondary cabinet. She was standing very still. Colton Briggs was 6 feet to her right, in plain clothes, with one hand on the cabinet door and the other holding his service weapon at his side. Not raised, not pointed, just present, which was its own form of language. Mara assessed the space in the span of a breath. Concrete walls, narrow corridor, 2 exits, the dock entrance behind her and the internal door at the far end, which was propped open by a doorstop, giving her a partial view of the ER corridor. Priya's posture was controlled, which meant she was afraid but functioning. Briggs had his back partially to the cabinet, which meant he was protecting something in it, or taking something from it. She couldn't tell which yet. She walked forward at a measured pace. Briggs heard her. He turned. His expression moved through surprise before settling into something harder. "I said nobody comes in here," he said. "You didn't say that to me," Mara said. She kept walking. "Stop." She stopped at 12 feet, close enough to read him clearly, far enough that he had to make a decision before he could reach her, and decisions take time. "Priya," Mara said, without looking away from Briggs. "Walk toward me." Priya moved. Briggs took half a step forward and then didn't complete it, which told Mara something important about where his head was. He was not in a position where he had thought this through. He had come here with a goal, the cabinet, whatever was in it, and the goal was already compromised, and he knew it, and he was now in the specific dangerous territory of a person whose plan has failed and who hasn't yet decided what replaces it. Priya reached Mara and stopped beside her. "Whatever you came for," Mara said to Briggs, "it's not in there anymore. The federal team has been through that cabinet 3 times in the last 18 hours. His jaw tightened. "There are documents, physical records that weren't in the initial seizure." "Then they're already logged," Mara said. "Tillis disclosed the location of everything last night. The only reason something would still be in that cabinet is because the federal team left it there intentionally." She watched that land, watched him work through it. "That's not possible," he said. "It's exactly possible," she said. "They do it so they can observe who comes back for it." The silence in the corridor had a physical weight. Somewhere down the ER end she could hear normal hospital sounds, a monitor beeping, a cart moving, and those sounds made the stillness here stranger. Briggs looked at the cabinet, then at Mara. His weapon was still at his side. "Put that away," she said. Not an order exactly. More like a piece of practical advice. He didn't move for 3 seconds. Then, slowly, he holstered it. Not because she had authority over him, but because the logic of the situation had finally reached him and the weapon was making everything worse, which some part of him understood even now. Ruark stepped into the corridor behind Mara, 2 agents behind him. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Briggs looked at the tableau in front of him. Mara steady at the center of it, Priya beside her, Ruark at the door, federal agents flanking. And something went out of him. Not dramatically. Just the specific deflation of a person who has run out of moves and knows it. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's a good idea," Ruark said. "Oh." The arrest took 4 minutes. Mara stood in the corridor with Priya while it happened and didn't watch, not out of discomfort, but because watching served no purpose, and Priya needed someone to stand next to who was looking at her and not at Briggs. "I'm okay," Priya said. "I know," Mara said. "He said he needed to access something, and if I called anyone, he used the word complicate." Priya's voice was steady, which was an achievement. "I've been charged it by a 70-pound patient in a manic episode. I wasn't going to fall apart over a man with a bad plan and a gun on his hip." "I know that too," Mara said. Priya looked at her for a moment. "You walked in here like you already knew where he'd be." "I didn't know," Mara said. "I made an educated assessment." "Is that what they called it in the military?" Mara almost smiled. "Mostly they called it read the room and move." Priya let out a breath that had been waiting to come out for a few minutes. "I need coffee, and then I need to go manage a floor." "Go," Mara said. "I'll cover the next hour." Briggs was taken out through the ambulance bay entrance in handcuffs, in plain clothes, at 2:50 in the afternoon. The timing meant that the shift change overlap was happening and there were more staff present than usual, which Mara suspected was not entirely accidental on Ruark's part. People who had been on that ER floor yesterday morning, people who had watched Briggs grab her badge, who had stood in frozen witness to the specific humiliation of a colleague who hadn't done anything, those people saw him go. Nobody cheered, nobody said anything. The hallway just went quiet in the way that hallways go quiet when something that needs to happen finally does. Garrett, at the nurse's station, watched through the bay window and then turned back to his station and began updating the patient board with the focused energy of someone who needs to do something with his hands. Dr. Avila was at the end of the corridor. She looked at Mara. She gave one small, firm nod. Mara returned it. That was enough. At 4 o'clock, Colonel Osterman reconvened the meeting in the boardroom with 3 additional attendees who had arrived while the situation in the supply corridor was resolving. One was from the Arizona Attorney General's office. One was from the Department of Defense Inspector General's regional office. The third was a woman named Supervisory Agent Rena Cho from the FBI's Phoenix Field Division, who had driven up after Tillis's disclosure had been forwarded to her office, and who had the focused, economical manner of someone who has handled complex financial crime cases and doesn't need anything explained twice. The Briggs arrest was addressed first, documented, logged into the existing case file, connected to the supply corridor incident as evidence of consciousness of guilt and attempted evidence tampering. Cho took notes on a legal pad with the handwriting of someone who still trusts paper over devices in rooms full of people she doesn't know. Then the meeting turned to the broader network. Mara sat and listened as the shape of what had been happening at Hartwell Memorial and at Sage Bend Regional in Flagstaff and at Clearwater Community Hospital outside Scottsdale was laid out in the measured language of federal investigators who have assembled something large and are presenting it for the first time in a complete form. The supply diversion network had operated for 26 months. It had moved controlled medical supplies, specific categories of analgesics, hemostatic agents, advanced wound care materials, out of hospital inventory, and into a private distribution chain that sold them to unregulated buyers. Some domestic, some not. The connection to the forward operating bases had been confirmed overnight. 2 resupply shipments to an active deployment zone had included substituted materials, items that had passed visual inspection but were either expired, diluted, or in one documented case, entirely inert replacements in legitimate packaging. Mara listened to that last part and kept her face level and thought about soldiers in the field opening a medical kit and trusting what was in it. "How many shipments?" she asked. Cho looked at her. "We have confirmed documentation on 7. We believe the actual number is higher. The disclosure process is ongoing." 7. Mara did not do the math out loud. She did it internally and then set it aside because the math led to a place that wasn't useful right now, and useful was the only thing she could afford to be. "Devlin's connection to the DOB suppliers," Osterman said to Cho. "Is that solid?" 3 wire transfers, 2 phone records, and Tillis's direct testimony, Cho said. "It's solid." The AG's representative made a note. The DOD IG representative, who had said almost nothing for 40 minutes, looked up from his documents and said, "The military charges will run concurrently with the state and federal civilian charges. We're coordinating with JAG on the timeline." Bristead, still on screen at the end of the table, said, "The supply fraud affecting active deployment resupply falls under our direct jurisdiction. We'll be moving on that in parallel." The room absorbed all of this in the particular silence of people processing the full scope of something that had been visible in fragments and is now complete. Osterman turned to Mara. "I want to formally document your role in this for the record. Not the observation period, the intervention. What you did in that supply room when Tillis entered. What you did on the roof with Corporal Varick. What you did in this corridor 40 minutes ago." "Priya Balan should be documented," Mara said. "She held the situation in that corridor for 20 minutes before I got there. She didn't call out, didn't escalate in a way that would have provoked him. She managed it." "She'll be documented," Osterman said. "So will you." Mara didn't argue further. She understood that some things needed to exist on paper for the people who would need to read them later, and that resisting documentation was a form of false modesty that served no one. "The commendation record goes public at 0800 tomorrow," Osterman said. "Your former commanding officer has been notified. He asked me to tell you," and I'm quoting him, "It took long enough." Mara felt something move in her chest. She kept it from her face, mostly. The meeting concluded at 5:40. The federal team would be at Hartwell through at least the following week. The criminal referrals to the AG's office would proceed on a timeline Cho's team would manage. Devlin's formal arrest, he had been in a holding status at the hospital since the previous evening, would be processed that day. The two additional individuals named from the extended network, neither of whom were Hartwell employees, were already in federal custody. Mara walked out of the boardroom and down the stairwell to the first floor and back to the ER. Because the ER was still a functioning emergency department, and people were still sick and injured and needed care, and that had not stopped being true for a single hour of the past 2 days. She checked in with the float nurse covering her patients. She updated 2 charts. She assisted with a laceration case that was more complicated than it had looked on intake, a jagged wound from a landscaping accident that needed careful layered closure and was going to leave a scar regardless of how well the repair went, which Mara told the patient honestly because he was a 40-year-old man who asked her directly and deserved a direct answer. At 7:15, as she was finishing the post-procedure documentation, Garrett came to the station with the particular expression of someone delivering news they're uncertain about. "There's someone in the waiting room asking for you," he said. "Not a patient." "Who?" "Military. He walked in about 10 minutes ago. He's in a hospital gown over his uniform, which is kind of a lot to look at." Mara knew before she got to the waiting room. Jesse Varick was sitting in one of the standard waiting room chairs, which were designed for people who were waiting and not for people who had had a chest tube placed approximately 30 hours earlier and had been discharged from University Medical in what was almost certainly the minimum viable time frame. He was pale. He had one hand pressed carefully against his left side. His dog tags were visible at the collar of the gown, and his uniform pants were on because apparently full compliance with discharge instructions was not a priority. Tango was not with him. Varick had come alone. He looked up when she walked in. "You're not supposed to be mobile yet," she said. "I know," he said. "I told them I needed to do something and I'd come back." "Did they discharge you or did you just leave?" A pause. "There's some ambiguity about that." Mara sat in the chair across from him. She looked at the way he was holding his side and evaluated it. The posture of someone managing pain that is present but controlled, not the posture of someone whose repair was failing. He was okay. He was going to be uncomfortable for weeks, and he was being reckless with it, but he was okay. "What did you need to do?" she said. Varick looked at her steadily. He had the direct quality of young soldiers who have been in situations where indirectness costs lives and have therefore lost patience with it. "I needed to say it to your face," he said. "Not through Ruark, not through a report. You were on that roof, and you knew what was wrong when nobody else did. You fixed it. And then I found out what they did to you that morning, what Briggs did, what Devlin did. And I needed you to know that I know that." Mara was quiet for a moment. "You could have sent a message," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "But Tango ran to you, and I'm trying to have the same instincts as my dog, so here I am." It was such an unexpected thing to say that Mara actually felt the tension in her chest shift. Not dissolve. There was still too much unresolved for that. But move. The way things move when something genuinely human cuts through the operational noise. "Your instincts are good," she said. "Your judgment about discharge timing needs work." He almost smiled. "Yes, Sergeant." "Don't call me that. Ruark told me the record goes public tomorrow." "I know." "Then I'll call you whatever you want until then," he said. "After that, I'm calling you Sergeant." She stood up. "Come on. I'm going to check that site, and then I'm personally driving you back to University Medical." "I can get a cab." "You can," she said, "but you won't, because I want to make sure you actually go back, and I don't trust you to do that independently yet." She looked at him. "That's not an insult. That's a clinical assessment." He stood up carefully, with the specific economy of movement of someone who has learned exactly how much they can do without triggering the thing they're trying not to trigger. "You were always like this," he said. "Even in the field. You'd fix someone, and then you'd watch them like they were going to undo it the moment you looked away." "Because they usually do," she said. She drove him back to University Medical at 8:30 and handed him off to a very tired-looking nurse at the post-surgical care unit who looked at Varick with the expression of someone who had been told he would do exactly this, and is not surprised, but is professionally exasperated. Mara gave the nurse a complete summary of her assessment of the chest site and the pain management posture she'd observed, and the nurse wrote it down with the focused attention of a colleague taking a handoff seriously. "He's genuinely okay," Mara said quietly at the end. "I know," the nurse said, "but he doesn't get to decide that." "No," Mara agreed. He doesn't. She drove back to Hartwell. It was dark now, the city doing what desert cities do at night. The heat releasing slowly, the sky going from dusty orange to a clear, deep black faster than you'd expect. She sat in the parking structure for a few minutes before going back in. Not avoiding, just sitting. She thought about 26 months of fraud, 7 compromised shipments, the specific weight of what Tillis had disclosed in a federal building the night before because his attorneys had told him cooperation was his best option, which was probably true, and because the alternative was carrying the full weight of it alone, which he was apparently unwilling to do. She thought about the 6 weeks of notes on her phone, the time she'd spent debating whether to say something, to whom, in what format. She thought about the 11 people on Tango's documented alert list. 11 people from the same operational world she had moved through and then stepped back from. She thought about the door she'd kept closed for 2 years and what it meant that it was opening whether she chose it or not. She wasn't angry about that. She'd expected to be when it came, whatever form it came in. But sitting in the parking structure in the dark, she found that what she mostly felt was something closer to recognition. Like the version of herself that had taken this nursing job and built this quiet, competent, specific life, had always known this was still in her, had always known it would matter again, had just been waiting for the moment when it mattered in a way she couldn't walk past. She went back inside. The next 3 days moved in the specific rhythm of institutional aftermath, the part that doesn't make good narrative, but that is, in reality, most of what justice actually looks like. Meetings, documentation, formal statements given to Cho's team, and to the AG's representative, and to the military JAG officers, who arrived on the second day with their own sets of questions and their own documentation requirements. Evidence logs reviewed and signed, chain of custody confirmed for Mara's phone records, which were now formally part of 3 separate case files. Devlin was processed and transferred to federal custody on the morning of the second day. He did not speak publicly. His attorney issued a brief statement that contained the words, "vigorously contest and nothing else of substance." He was walked out of the building in handcuffs in front of a small contingent of press that had been gathering outside since the previous evening, drawn by the federal vehicles and the activity and the specific smell that media develop for stories in motion. Tillis entered a formal cooperation agreement on the 3rd day. The terms were not public, but the existence of it was, which meant his testimony would be part of the federal case against the network's upper tiers, the 3 individuals above Devlin who had initiated the distribution chain and had so far been managing their distance from it through intermediaries. Fennick resigned from Hartwell on the 2nd day. His resignation letter, which circulated through the staff faster than any official communication, cited personal reasons and expressed gratitude for 19 years of service. What it did not contain was any acknowledgement of what he had been aware of, what he had chosen not to see, what he had facilitated through the specific passivity of someone who benefits from a corrupt system without ever touching it directly. Mara read it. She set it down. She went to check on her patients. Briggs appeared before a disciplinary panel from his department on the morning of the 3rd day. The body camera footage from the day of Mara's removal, the full footage which showed the approach, the physical contact, the removal of her badge, the specific language he had used, was reviewed by the panel. The footage from the supply corridor where his weapon had been out and a charge nurse had been effectively held in place was reviewed by both the departmental panel and by Cho's office. He was suspended immediately pending formal proceedings. His representative called it premature. The panel chair called it procedurally appropriate and moved on. On the morning of the 4th day, at 8:02 a.m., the military commendation record posted to the public database. Mara was in the locker room when Priya knocked on the open door and looked at her with an expression that was specific and quiet and did not require words to convey what it was carrying. "It's up," Priya said. Mara nodded. "The night staff has been reading it," Priya said. "Some of them have been here a long time. Garrett cried a little, and he's going to deny it if you bring it up." "I won't bring it up," Mara said. "There's something else." Priya leaned against the doorframe. "The board met last night. Emergency session, obviously. With Devlin gone and the scope of what the investigation has found, they've been under pressure from 3 directions at once. They passed a resolution this morning." She paused. "They're establishing a formal review of all administrative decisions made under Devlin's tenure. Compensation reviews, hiring decisions, disciplinary actions. Mara looked at her. That's going to take months. Yes, Priya said. And in the interim, they've asked the department heads to identify who should be in an acting capacity in the roles that have been vacated or compromised. Who's covering administration? Priya's expression shifted to the particular look of someone who knows the answer to the question and is watching the other person figure out where this is going. They're not asking you to run administration, Priya said, but they are asking who should lead the review of clinical protocols and supply chain integrity for the emergency department going forward, who has both the clinical expertise and the other expertise. Mara was quiet. You don't have to decide anything today, Priya said. The board's formal request hasn't even been transmitted yet. I'm telling you because you're my colleague, and because I think you deserve to hear it from a person, not a letter. Mara picked up her stethoscope from her locker. She looked at it for a moment. Tell them I'll consider it, she said. That's not a no, Priya noted. It's not a no, Mara agreed. She walked out to the floor. Boab. The call from Ruark came at noon. Varek's being discharged properly today, he said. He asked me to tell you. Good, Mara said. He also asked me to tell you that Tango did his alert response again this morning when someone mentioned your name in the briefing, which Varek found funny and Pollard found professionally embarrassing. Tell Pollard it's a compliment. I'll pass it along. A brief pause. The classification review is complete. There's one more thing in your file that I wasn't aware of until this morning. Your former CO added a supplemental commendation citation 18 months ago. It was held in review pending the classification decision. Mara stopped walking. She was in the main corridor, staff moving around her. What citation? For the field intervention in the Coral Valley operation, Ruark said. Specifically for the triage decision that preserved combat effectiveness for 8 personnel under direct fire conditions. He paused. Your CO wrote in the citation that the decision you made in those conditions was the most tactically sound medical judgment he'd seen in 22 years of service. His words, not mine. Mara stood still. That also posts to the public record today, Ruark said. I wanted you to know before it did. She stood in the corridor with people moving around her in the ordinary motion of a hospital doing its work, and she thought about the Coral Valley and the specific minutes inside it that she had spent 2 years not thinking about, not because they were shameful, but because they were too heavy to carry in a daily life, and she had needed her hands free for other things. The citation had existed. Her CO had written it and submitted it, and it had been sitting in a classified file for 18 months while she restocked supply carts and placed IVs and caught a medication error before it reached a patient. Mara, Ruark said, you still there? I'm here, she said. For what it's worth, he said. Everything I've seen in the last 4 days. What you did on the roof. What you did in that corridor with Briggs. The 6 weeks of documentation that is now central evidence in a federal case. It's consistent with what that citation says. You didn't leave the best parts of yourself behind when you took off the uniform. She held the phone and looked at the corridor around her. The nurse's station, the bay curtains, the board with the patient names and room assignments, the ordinary, essential, imperfect machinery of people trying to keep other people alive. I need to get back to work, she said. I know, Ruark said, but there's one more thing, and I need you to hear it now. The tone in his voice shifted. Not alarm, something more contained than that, but with weight in it. We pulled the full visitor log for the building, he said. Going back 14 days, cross-referenced against the supply room access records and the camera repositioning event. And? There's a name in the log that shouldn't be there, he said. Someone with access to this facility who is connected to one of the 3 individuals above Devlin in the network. Someone who was in this building 4 days before Tillis came to the supply room. Someone who, given the timeline, would have been present when the decision was made to file the theft report against you. Mara was very still. Who? She said. Dr. Leonard Fenwick, Ruark said. His personal cell phone pinged off the same tower as one of the network's upper-tier contacts at 11:40 p.m. 3 nights ago, after he submitted his resignation, after he should have had no further operational involvement with anyone connected to this case. Mara thought about Fenwick on the roof. The pause before he moved. The 2 attempts to reassert himself during Varek's stabilization. The specific, careful quality of a man who performs incompetence when it suits him. He's not just a bystander who looked away, she said. No, Rourke said. We don't believe he is. A pause. His resignation was accepted this morning by a board that didn't know what we know, which means he walked out of this building with no restrictions on his movement. Mara looked at the supply corridor entrance at the end of the hall. At the secondary cabinet, she could partially see through the open door. At the repositioned camera above it that had caught Devlin and Tillis at 3:47 in the morning. Where is he now? She said. That, Rourke said carefully, is the problem. Mara ended the call and stood in the corridor for exactly 4 seconds. That was how long it took to run through the immediate variables. Fenwick's access history, his known connections in the building, the places a person who had worked somewhere for 19 years would know to go that a federal team new to the facility would not think to check first. She walked to the nurses' station and pulled up the hospital's internal directory on the terminal. Fenwick had resigned, which meant his badge access should have been suspended. She checked the access revocation log. It had been submitted at 9:14 that morning. The board had accepted his resignation at 8:57, 17 minutes between acceptance and badge revocation. She pulled the badge access log for the morning. Fenwick's badge had been used at 8:41 to access the medical records archive on sublevel 1. 13 minutes before his resignation was formally accepted. 16 minutes before his access was cut. She called Rourke back. Sublevel 1 archive, she said when he picked up. He used his badge there at 8:41, before the revocation went through. We're 2 minutes behind you, Rourke said. Already moving. What's in that archive that connects to the network? Physical transfer records, Rourke said. The kind that don't exist in the digital system. Fenwick was on the receiving committee for supply orders for 11 years. His signature is on documentation that connects the hospital's order records to the diversion timestamps. If those physical records disappear, the documentation chain breaks, Mara said. At minimum, it complicates 3 of the 7 confirmed diversion events. She was already moving toward the sublevel stairwell. I know where the archive stacks are. I've pulled records from there twice for patient history requests. Mara. Rourke's voice had the specific quality of someone making a calculated decision. Don't engage him. Locate and hold position. I know, she said. She took the stairwell. Sublevel 1 was below the parking structure, accessible by 2 stairwells and 1 service elevator. It housed the physical records archive, the hospital's primary HVAC infrastructure, and a maintenance workshop that was used about twice a month by facilities staff. The lighting was functional but lower than the floors above, long fluorescent tubes spaced further apart, the kind of institutional light that makes shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. Mara moved through the main archive corridor without running. She could hear the HVAC systems, the low ambient machinery of a building sustaining itself. She passed the first row of shelving, patient records by decade, the older files in lateral drawers, the newer ones in labeled boxes, and turned toward the supply order section, which was in the back third of the archive, separated from the patient records by a wall of metal shelving tall enough that you couldn't see over it. She heard him before she saw him. A drawer closing, the specific sound of cardboard on metal shelving. Movement that was trying to be quiet but couldn't entirely get there, because Fenwick was a physician who had spent his career in hospitals, and not a person trained to move silently. She rounded the end of the shelving row and stopped. Fenwick was at the third cabinet from the left. He had a canvas bag open on the floor beside him, and he was removing folders from the open drawer and placing them in the bag with the focused, deliberate efficiency of a person who knows exactly what they need and is moving as fast as careful will allow. I was in street clothes. He had left that morning, after all, as a resigned employee, and he looked smaller than he did in a white coat, which was a thing that happened to certain people when you removed their context. He heard her stop. He turned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Fenwick's face moved through several things in quick succession. Surprise, assessment, something that might have been a calculated decision about whether to try an explanation. He was 61 years old and had spent 4 decades being the most credentialed person in most rooms he entered. Even now, with a canvas bag full of documents he was in the process of stealing, there was something in his posture that reached for authority. "Nurse Solis," he said. "Put the folders back," she said. "These are administrative records that I have a legitimate—" "Your badge access was revoked at 9:14, she said. "You used it at 8:41. You've been in this building for over 3 hours after submitting your resignation, accessing an archive that contains evidence in a federal criminal investigation. She looked at the bag. Whatever explanation you're about to give me, it needs to be better than that. His jaw tightened. You don't understand the full picture. I understand enough of it, she said. I've understood pieces of it for 6 weeks and I've been patient about the parts I didn't have yet. But I know what those folders are and I know what removing them does to the case. She kept her voice even. Put them back, Leonard. The use of his first name seemed to land differently than anything else she'd said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a person being seen clearly by someone they had categorized as irrelevant and finding that the experience is more destabilizing than they expected. I wasn't involved in the diversion, he said. I want you to understand that. The supply transfers, the fraud. I didn't participate in that. But you knew, she said. A long pause. The HVAC systems hummed around them. I knew something was off with the inventory patterns about a year ago, he said. I raised it internally. Devlin told me it was a legacy accounting issue being corrected. I chose to believe him. He stopped. I chose to believe him because not believing him had implications I wasn't prepared to deal with. And then you found out you were wrong about him. About 6 months ago, he said. I found documentation I wasn't supposed to find. I didn't go to the authorities because by that point I had said nothing for 6 months, and I knew what that looked like. So instead you let them file a theft accusation against me, Mara said. You were in that boardroom when the strategy was discussed. Ruark's team found the phone record. Fenwick looked at the floor. In the low archive light, he looked genuinely old in a way he didn't always. I didn't suggest it. I didn't stop it either. That's the same thing, Mara said. In the moment that mattered, choosing not to stop something is the same as choosing it. She heard the stairwell door at the far end of the archive open, Ruark's people, moving fast but not running. She didn't turn around. Fenwick looked at the agents coming toward him. Then he looked back at Mara. Something in his face shifted, not quite remorse, which would have required more self-awareness than he currently had access to, but something adjacent to it. The particular look of a person who has finally run completely out of the distance they've been maintaining between themselves and the truth. He put the folder in his hand back in the drawer. He set the canvas bag on the floor. He did not try to run or argue or negotiate. He stood still and let the agents reach him, and when they did, he said, very quietly, I want to cooperate. Mara turned and walked back to the stairwell. The formal processing of Leonard Fenwick took the rest of the afternoon and well into the evening. He was not arrested immediately. His cooperation offer was taken seriously by Cho's office, which meant a different kind of processing, the kind that involves federal attorneys and recorded statements and careful construction of what cooperation actually means and what it's worth. By the time the initial session was complete, it was past 7 in the evening, and the federal team's picture of the network had expanded again. Fenwick had known more than he had acknowledged. Not the operational details of the diversion, he had told the truth about that, but the identity of the individual above Devlin who had initiated the network's expansion to the Hartwell facility. A man named Theodore Garst, who held a senior position in a private healthcare logistics company that contracted with all 3 hospitals affected by the diversion. Garst had approached Devlin 2.5 years ago. Devlin had brought in Tillis. Tillis had recruited Briggs as a local law enforcement contact who could suppress internal complaints. The complaint suppression was Briggs's specific role. He had not been involved in the supply transfers. He had been involved in making sure that anyone who raised questions inside the hospital was handled before those questions reached any external authority. 3 prior incidents: a pharmacy technician who had flagged an inventory discrepancy 8 months ago, a receiving dock supervisor who had questioned a shipment manifest, and a former nursing assistant who had been terminated after asking about missing equipment, all had Briggs's fingerprints on the resolution. None of them had known why they'd been shut down. None of them had known about each other. Mara learned this from Ruark at 8:15 in the break room over bad coffee that neither of them commented on. The pharmacy technician, she said. Where is she now? She took a job at a clinic in Scottsdale, Ruark said. She's been contacted by Cho's office. She'll be a witness. And the dock supervisor? Still here, actually. He transferred to a different department, facilities. Mara thought about that. 3 people who had seen something true and had been shut down before the truth could go anywhere. 3 people whose instincts had been correct, and whose institutional position had made them easy to dismiss and silence. She thought about what it had cost each of them, not dramatically, not in the ways that make good narrative, but in the specific daily cost of being told you were wrong about something you knew you were right about. They need to know, she said, whatever the legal process looks like. They need to know that they weren't wrong. Cho's team will handle that, Rourke said. I know, Mara said. I'm saying it should happen. It will, he said. And then, for what it's worth, your documentation was what connected the internal pattern to the federal surveillance timeline. Bristed told me this morning that without your records, the overlap between the hospital-side observations and the surveillance data would have taken another 4 to 6 weeks to establish with enough specificity for a warrant. He looked at his coffee. 6 weeks, with soldiers receiving compromised resupply and active deployment. Mara didn't say anything. She sat with the weight of that specific piece of arithmetic and let it be what it was. You did something real, Rourke said. I want you to know that I know that, and that it will be in the record. A lot of people did something real, she said. Priya held a corridor for 20 minutes. Avila documented the rooftop intervention honestly when she didn't have to. Garrett called me instead of assuming Priya was fine. She looked at Rourke. The record should say all of that. It will, he said again. Oh. Theodore Garst was arrested at his home in Scottsdale at 6:40 the following morning. The arrest was conducted by Cho's team in coordination with 2 other federal agencies, and it was not the kind of arrest that happens quietly. Garst had resources and connections, and a lawyer who arrived before the agents had finished processing the warrant, which slowed certain things but didn't change any of the essential ones. The evidence package that Cho's team presented, the wire transfers, the logistics records, the distribution documentation, Tillis's testimony, and now Fenwick's cooperation statement, was specific enough that the lawyer's presence functioned primarily as professional courtesy rather than strategic defense. By noon, the existence of the arrests, Devlin, Briggs, and now Garst, was public. The press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office was careful in its language and complete in its scope. It named Hartwell Memorial specifically. It named the Supply Diversion Network specifically. It named the Military Resupply Connection specifically. It did not name Mara Solis. The commendation record that had posted the previous morning named her in detail. By afternoon, both things were circulating in the same news cycle, and the connection between them was not subtle. Mara was in the ER when the first call came in from a journalist. She didn't answer it. She sent it to voicemail and went back to a patient in Bay 3 who needed a wound assessment updated. The second call came 40 minutes later. She didn't answer that one either. At 2 in the afternoon, Priya came to her with a look that was half warning and half something else. There are 2 reporters in the waiting room, she said, and a camera crew in the parking lot. Tell the waiting room that this is a working emergency department, and if they're not patients, they need to leave, Mara said. The parking lot is a parking lot, and I can't do anything about that. What do you want me to say if they ask about you? Say that the staff is focused on patient care, Mara said. Because we are. Priya studied her for a moment. You're not going to talk to them. I'm going to talk to the people who need to be talked to, Mara said, which is the board, and Cho's team, and the pharmacy technician and doc supervisor that Briggs shut down, if they want to talk. The press will write what they write, and it'll be accurate because the public record is accurate. You're not curious about how the story gets told? I know how the story gets told, Mara said. I just don't need to be the one telling it. The board meeting was scheduled for the following morning at 9. Mara arrived at 8:50 and sat in the same boardroom where Osterman had placed the commendation citation in front of her 5 days ago. The room felt different now, less federal, more institutional, the specific atmosphere of an organization trying to locate itself after a significant portion of its leadership structure had been removed and charged with federal crimes. 7 board members were present. The interim CEO, a woman named Patricia Vollmer, who had been pulled from the board itself to cover the administrative gap, sat at the head of the table with the expression of someone who has been handed a situation they didn't design and is determined to handle it with more integrity than the one that preceded it. Vollmer was direct. She presented the board's conclusions from the internal review, which were still incomplete but had reached several immediate findings. The supply chain oversight structure at Hartwell was compromised systemically and needed to be rebuilt from scratch. The clinical department's role in inventory monitoring had been deliberately minimized to reduce internal accountability, and the emergency department, specifically, had been under administrative pressure to reduce reporting activity for the past 18 months. We're asking the emergency department to take a lead role in the integrity review, Vollmer said. That includes supply chain oversight, clinical protocol verification, and internal reporting mechanisms. She looked at Mara. We're asking you specifically to chair the clinical oversight committee and to design the new reporting structure. I'm a floor nurse, Mara said. You're a floor nurse with a military medical commendation record that went public 48 hours ago, one of the other board members said. He was not unkind about it. And 6 weeks of documented observation that is now central evidence in a federal case. The credentialing question is the least complicated part of this. Mara looked at Vollmer. I have conditions. Tell me, Vollmer said. The pharmacy technician who flagged the inventory discrepancy 8 months ago. I want to know her name, and I want her offered reinstatement or compensation, whichever she prefers. The doc supervisor who questioned the manifest. I want his transfer reversed if he wants it reversed, and I want a formal acknowledgement in his personnel file that his original concern was valid. And Priya Balan chairs the Nursing Oversight Subcommittee, not as a courtesy appointment, but with actual authority and actual resources. Vollmer did not hesitate. Agreed. I also want the float pool positions made permanent, Mara said. All 3 of them. The reason this department has been short-staffed is because temporary positions cost less on paper and somebody was managing the budget to look better than it was. That requires finance committee approval, a board member said. Then put it to finance, Mara said. I'm not accepting the oversight role if the department I'm overseeing is still operating at staffing levels that put patients at risk. The board member looked at Vollmer. Vollmer looked at the board. The conversation that followed lasted 11 minutes. Mara sat and waited and did not modify her position. The float positions were approved pending Finance Committee ratification, which Vollmer indicated would be expedited. Mara accepted the role. On her way out of the boardroom, she stopped in the doorway and looked back at Vollmer. One more thing, she said. The 3 other people that Briggs shut down before me. There may be more. I want a full review of every internal complaint filed in this department in the past 3 years. Whatever was dismissed, I want to know what was behind it. Vollmer nodded. Consider it part of your mandate. Mara left. Jesse Varick was properly discharged from University Medical on day 6. Mara knew because he sent her a text message that read, "Discharged properly this time. Tango says hello." She read it between patients and replied, "Tell Tango I said his instincts are better than most people I know." The response came back as a photo of Tango sitting in the passenger seat of a military transport vehicle, looking entirely satisfied with himself. She set the phone face down and went back to work, but she was smiling, which Garrett noticed and wisely chose not to comment on. Ruark came by the hospital on day 7 to close out the on-site portion of the federal operation. Most of his team had already rotated back. He found her in the supply room, the same shelves, the cabinet with the repositioned camera above it, restocking her cart. Cho's office will be in contact about the trial timeline, he said. Probably 4 to 6 months before the preliminary hearings, longer before anything goes to trial. I know how it works, she said. I know you do. He leaned against the doorframe. Garst's lawyers are trying to negotiate. The indications are that he's not willing to do what Tillis did, which means the trial will be contested and long. That's fine, Mara said. I'll be here. He was quiet for a moment. Osterman wanted me to pass something along. She said, and I'm quoting, that in her 27 years she's encountered very few people who understand that the most important decisions are the ones that happen before anyone is watching. She said you're one of them. Mara set down the dressing box she was holding. She thought about 6 weeks of notes in a phone app. She thought about the specific moment in this room when she had stepped between Warren Tillis and that cabinet. Not because she had known what it would lead to, not because she had any plan beyond the simple assessment that something was wrong, and the wrong thing to do was nothing. Tell her I said thank you, Mara said, and tell her the person who actually understood that was the doc supervisor who questioned a manifest 6 months ago and got shut down for it. I just had more protection. Ruark looked at her. That's a generous way to frame it. It's an accurate way to frame it, she said. He left. She finished restocking her cart and walked back to the floor. The months that followed were not easy in the way that institutional repair is never easy. The Oversight Committee met twice a week in the first month, once a week after that. The new reporting structure required documentation and training and the specific patient work of convincing people who had been told for years that raising concerns was professionally risky, that it was now not only safe, but expected. That part was harder than the structural work. Structures are easy. Human beings take longer. The pharmacy technician's name was Rosa Almada. She came in on a Tuesday afternoon in the second month to meet with Mara and Vollmer. She was 26 years old and had been working at a smaller clinic since Briggs had effectively ended her position at Hartwell. She was composed and professional in the meeting, and she cried for about 90 seconds when Vollmer gave her the formal acknowledgement letter, and then she stopped and said, "I just need to know it was real, that I wasn't imagining it." "You weren't imagining it," Mara said. "They made me feel like I was," Rosa said. "I know," Mara said. "That's what happens when the system that's supposed to protect you is the one targeting you. It doesn't mean you were wrong. It means the system was." Rosa accepted the reinstatement offer. She started in the pharmacy department 3 weeks later. She was good at her job. She had always been good at her job. The doc supervisor, his name was Terrell Okafor, declined the transfer reversal but accepted the personnel file acknowledgement, which he read in Mara's office with the particular quiet of someone who has been carrying a weight for months and is only now setting it down. He shook Mara's hand when he left and said, "I kept thinking maybe I miscounted. Maybe the manifest was right and I just didn't know how to read it." "You read it correctly," Mara said. "Yeah," he said. "I know that now." Briggs's departmental hearing concluded in the third month. The findings were formal and specific. Unauthorized use of police authority to suppress civilian complaints, improper evidence handling, conduct unbecoming, and the incident in the supply corridor, which was classified as reckless endangerment of a civilian. His badge was revoked. The process was not fast and it was not clean. He had a union representative and an attorney, and both of them fought every procedural step. But it concluded where it needed to conclude, in the particular way that accountability arrives in institutional systems, slowly, with paperwork, and without drama at the end. He appealed. The appeal failed. He was done. Fenwick's cooperation agreement resulted in a reduced charge in exchange for his full testimony against Garst and the remaining network members. He pled guilty to obstruction and failure to report criminal activity. He was sentenced to 18 months supervised release and a permanent revocation of his medical license. He did not return to Hartwell. He did not return to medicine. Whether he came to a full accounting of what his silence had cost other people was a question Mara had no way to answer and stopped trying to. Devlin and Tillis pled guilty in the fourth month, part of a negotiated resolution that the U.S. Attorney's Office accepted in exchange for full testimony against Garst. Their sentencing hearings were scheduled for the following year. Devlin's attorney issued a statement that contained the word remorse, which his victims read in various ways. Garst went to trial. It took 11 weeks. Mara testified for 4 hours on the second day, speaking to the federal investigators from Cho's office about her documentation process, her observations, the timeline of events, and her assessment of the supply chain discrepancies. She was cross-examined for 90 minutes by Garst's lead attorney, who was skilled and methodical and tried 3 different approaches to characterizing her records as selective, retaliatory, and technically unqualified. Each approach failed in the specific way that attacks on accurate records fail when the records are specific and the person presenting them is not rattled. The jury deliberated for 2 days, guilty on all 14 counts. Mara was in the ER when the verdict came in. Ruark texted her a single word, "Done." She read it, put the phone in her pocket, and went to check on a patient in Bay 2 who was recovering from a moderate allergic reaction and needed discharge instructions. That was the moment. That was how it arrived. Not in a boardroom or a corridor, not with a crowd watching or a camera present. In a bay, with paperwork, and a patient asking her whether they needed an EpiPen prescription, and Mara answering clearly and specifically because that was what the patient needed and that was what she was there for. 8 months after the day Colton Briggs grabbed her badge and walked her out of the building, Mara Solis stood in the same first-floor corridor, the same polished floor, the same fluorescent overhead lights, the same supply room door at the end of the hall, and conducted the first training session for Hartwell's new internal reporting protocol. There were 14 people in the session, 6 nurses, 3 physicians including Avila, 2 pharmacy staff, including Rosa, 2 from facilities, including Terrell Okafor, and Priya, who sat in the back and said almost nothing, and whose presence was more stabilizing than most things Mara could have planned for. Mara had written the protocol herself, over 3 weeks, with input from Cho's office and from Bristet's team, and from Priya, and from a risk management consultant who knew how hospitals fail and was direct about it. The document was 22 pages. It was specific about what constituted a reportable concern, who it was reported to, how the report was tracked, what protections existed for the person reporting, and what happened if those protections were violated. She didn't stand at a podium. She stood in the middle of the corridor. "I'm going to tell you something that isn't in the protocol document," she said, "because protocols don't account for the part that's actually hardest." She looked at the group, at Rosa, who had been dismissed for doing the right thing, at Terrell, who had spent months wondering if he'd misread a manifest, at Garrett, who had made a phone call when he wasn't sure he should, at Avila, who had documented the truth and accepted the complications of doing so. The hardest part isn't identifying something that's wrong. Most of the time you already know. You feel it before you can name it. The hardest part is believing that what you feel is real enough to act on, when the system around you is telling you to leave it alone. The corridor was quiet. "This protocol is designed to protect you when you act on it," she said. "But I want to be clear about something. The protocol doesn't create the courage. You bring that. The protocol just makes sure that when you do, it goes somewhere instead of disappearing." She paused. "Rosa Almada flagged an inventory discrepancy 8 months before I did. Terrell Okafor questioned a shipment manifest before either of us. They were both right. They were both shut down. That is on the institution, not on them. And we are rebuilding this institution specifically so that can't happen again. But I want you to hear their names in this context, because the story of what happened here doesn't start with a military helicopter landing on the roof. It starts with 2 people doing the boring, specific, unglamorous work of paying attention and saying something." Rosa was looking at her hands. Terrell was looking directly at Mara with the expression of a man hearing something he'd needed said. "Pay attention," Mara said. "Trust what you see. Say something. And then, and this is the part that matters, don't stop being the person who does that just because it was hard once." She opened the protocol document. "Now let's walk through the specifics," she said, "because the specifics are what make the difference between something that sounds good and something that actually works." After the session, Avila stopped her in the corridor. "You didn't talk about yourself at all," Avila said. "It wasn't about me," Mara said. "You know that's not entirely true." "It's true enough," Mara said. "What happened to me is useful as context. It's not useful as the center of the story, because if it becomes about one person, then people tell themselves they're not that person, and they stop paying attention." Avila considered that. "That's a very deliberate way to think about your own experience." "I've had time to work out what to do with it," Mara said. Avila nodded slowly. "How are you?" "Actually." Mara thought about that honestly, in the way that she had learned was the only kind of answer worth giving when someone asked with genuine intent. "I'm tired," she said, "and I'm still processing some of it. The Coral Valley citation being public was harder than I expected, not because it's wrong, but because I'd gotten very comfortable with the version of myself that existed without anyone knowing that story." She paused. "But I think I was also hiding in that version a little, staying quiet as a way of staying safe. And now? Now I'm the person who runs the oversight committee and trains the staff and makes sure Rosa Almada's name is in the record alongside mine," Mara said. "Which means being seen. So I'm learning to be okay with being seen." Avila was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, for what it's worth, what I saw on that roof. That was you. The citations and the record just confirmed something that was already visible, if you knew to look." Mara looked at the supply room door at the end of the corridor, at the ordinary, functional, specific space where she had stepped between a man and a cabinet and set a chain of events in motion that she couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have chosen and wouldn't undo. "That's the thing about being underestimated," she said. "It only works if you start to believe it too." She picked up her cart and walked back to the floor. There is something that doesn't get said enough about the people who hold the lines in places like hospitals. Not the ones with their names on walls or their faces in press releases, but the ones who show up at 6:40 in the morning and notice that something is wrong and write it down and keep writing it down even when nothing seems to be happening. The ones who step between someone who doesn't have credentials and the cabinet they shouldn't be touching, not because they have a plan, but because standing still was not something they were built for. Those people rarely get to see the full picture of what their attention prevented, the harm that didn't happen. The patients who received the right equipment because someone noticed the inventory was off. The soldiers in the field who got what was in the package instead of what had been swapped for profit. The Rosa Almadas who find out months later that they were right all along. Mara Solis spent 2 years trying to be a person who didn't need to be known. She was good at it, in the way that people who have trained to survive are good at occupying exactly the space they need and no more. But she was also, unavoidably, a person who paid attention, who noticed, who stepped in, who kept records, who walked toward the cabinet when the easier choice was to keep moving. The uniform she'd set aside hadn't changed any of that. The silence she'd kept hadn't changed any of that. The people who dismissed her, who looked at her badge and saw only a floor nurse, who filed accusations against her and walked her out of her own department, none of them had changed any of that. Because what you are isn't stored in a title or a record or a room that someone else controls access to. It's in what you do when the moment costs something. It's in what you reach for when the easier thing is clearly available and you don't reach for it. It's in the notes you keep when no one is watching and the cabinet you stand in front of when no one told you to. Mara stood in the hallway that had humiliated her and built something in it. Not because she needed the symmetry, but because it was where the work was. And she had always known, even in the years of quiet, that the work was what she came for. Not the recognition, not the record, the work.